The call came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in September, and Daniel Morrison knew before he even looked at the screen that his life was about to change again. Not for the better. It never was anymore. The phone buzzed against the cheap particle board nightstand in his cramped Chicago apartment. The sound too loud in the silence of a city that never really slept, but sometimes pretended to. His ex-wife, Jennifer, had gotten the house in the divorce, the nice three-bedroom in Evanston with the backyard where Emma used to play. Dan got the studio apartment in a building that smelled like curry and cigarette smoke, where the radiator clanked all night and the neighbors argued in languages he didn't understand. He grabbed the phone. His mother's number glowed in the darkness. "Danny," her voice was tight, strangled. "Your grandfather passed away this evening." The words hit him but didn't quite penetrate. Grandpa Tom, 82 years old, stubborn as Montana granite, the man who'd built Sweetwater Ranch from nothing and never forgiven Dan for leaving it behind. The last time they'd spoken was 3 years ago, Christmas, when Dan had made his obligatory visit and Tom had looked at him with those hard gray eyes and said the words that still burned. "City made you soft and greedy, boy. You forgot where you came from." "The funeral's Saturday," his mother continued. "You need to come home." Home. The word felt like a fist in his chest. Montana hadn't been home since he was 18, since he'd packed his bags and headed to Northwestern University and never looked back. That was 24 years ago. A lifetime. Another person's life. "I'll be there," he heard himself say. After he hung up, he sat in the darkness of his apartment and listened to Emma breathing in the tiny bedroom. She was 10 now, sleeping in the only real bed while he took the pull-out couch. The custody arrangement gave him 50% of the time, but that was a legal fiction. Emma's real life was with Jennifer in the house with the backyard, in the neighborhood with the good schools. This place was just where she visited her failure of a father. The numbers ran through Dan's head the way they always did now, an endless loop of financial anxiety that never quite let him sleep. $847 in his checking account, $43,000 in credit card debt, rent due in 5 days, and he was $200 short. Emma needed a winter coat. Her shoes were getting tight. He'd lost his job as a financial advisor 6 months ago when the firm collapsed under the weight of a fraud scandal he'd had nothing to do with. But the taint stuck anyway. Nobody wanted to hire the guy who'd worked for the crooks, even if he'd been clean. 6 years of building a career, gone. 12 years of marriage, gone. The life he'd constructed so carefully in the city, the life that was supposed to prove to Grandpa Tom that leaving the ranch had been the right choice, all of it gone. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his adult life analyzing other people's financial situations, helping them build wealth and security, and here he was at 42, broke and broken, sleeping on a pull-out couch and counting pennies. He thought about Grandpa Tom lying in a hospital bed, or maybe already at the funeral home, that hard, weathered face finally still. They'd never reconciled. Dan had tried, a few times over the years, awkward phone calls that went nowhere. Tom had no patience for excuses or explanations. You were either the kind of man who kept his promises to the land, or you weren't. Dan wasn't. Simple as that. Morning came gray and cold. Emma found him at the kitchenette table, laptop open, searching for plane tickets he couldn't afford. "Daddy?" Her voice was small, worried. She'd learned to read his moods over the past year, learned the difference between regular stressed and about to break down stressed. "What's wrong?" He closed the laptop, no point hiding it. She was smart, too smart sometimes. She saw everything. "Great-grandpa Tom died yesterday. We need to go to Montana for the funeral." Her eyes went wide. She'd only met Tom once during that last disastrous Christmas visit, but she'd heard the stories. The ranch, the mountains, the life Dan had left behind. "Montana? Really? Will there be horses?" The excitement in her voice made his chest tighten. When was the last time she'd been excited about anything? The divorce had been hardest on her, watching her parents' marriage disintegrate into lawyers and custody schedules. She'd started having nightmares. Her grades slipped. The therapist Jennifer insisted on said Emma was showing signs of anxiety and depression. She was 10 years old. "Yes, sweetheart, there will be horses and cattle, and probably more dust than you've ever seen." Can we really go? I mean, she trailed off, but he knew what she meant. Can we afford it? He looked at his daughter's hopeful face and made a decision that was probably stupid but felt necessary. He'd put the tickets on a credit card that was nearly maxed out. They'd go. They'd pay respects to Tom. They'd get through the weekend, and then they'd come back to Chicago and figure out how to survive another month. We can go, he said, and watched her face light up in a way it hadn't in months. The ticket confirmation email felt like a small betrayal, another few $100s added to the mountain of debt he couldn't climb. But Emma was already running to her room to pack, calling out questions about what to bring and whether it would be parallel and if she could learn to ride a horse. For the first time since the divorce, she sounded like a kid again. The flight from O'Hare to Billings gave Dan 4 hours to remember things he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. The ranch at dawn, frost on the grass, and cattle moving like shadows through the mist. Grandpa Tom's hands, gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of work, teaching him to splice rope and mend fence and read the weather and the color of the sky at sunset. The smell of hay and leather and honest sweat. The bone-deep satisfaction of a day's hard work finished. And the suffocation. The sense that the ranch was a trap, that staying would mean becoming his father. Another generation bound to the land, working yourself into an early grave for the privilege of maintaining something that never quite turned a profit. Dan had watched his father, aged 20 years and 10, watch the ranch wear him down until he died at 63, with nothing to show for his life but calloused hands and a gravestone in the family plot. That wasn't going to be Dan's story. He'd gotten out. He'd made something of himself. Except here he was, 42 and broke, flying back to Montana on a credit card he couldn't pay off, to bury the man whose disappointment had hung over his entire adult life. Emma pressed her face against the airplane window as they descended into Billings, watching the vast expanse of Montana spread out below them. Grassland and mountains and endless sky. She'd grown up in suburbs and city, had never seen horizon like this. "It's so big," she whispered. "Wait until you see the ranch," Dan said. 12,000 acres. It goes on forever. They picked up a rental car, the cheapest available, and drove the 2 hours southwest to the ranch. The landscape changed as they left the city behind, rolling hills giving way to genuine mountains, subdivisions replaced by ranches marked with fences and cattle guards, and names on wooden signs that had weathered decades of storms. Morrison, Henderson, Patterson. Families who'd been here for generations, who'd never left, who probably thought Dan was exactly the kind of fool Grandpa Tom always said he was. The town looked exactly as Dan remembered. One stoplight, a main street lined with brick buildings from the 1920s, the feed store, the diner, the Methodist church with its white steeple, population 800 and declining, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and leaving was considered either ambition or betrayal depending on who you asked. Sweetwater Ranch sat 5 miles outside town, down a gravel road that kicked up dust behind the rental car. The main house appeared as they crested a rise, log construction, sprawling and solid, built by Tom's own hands in the 1960s. The wraparound porch looked out over pastures that stretched to the horizon. Red barns, white trim, everything neat and orderly in a way that spoke of pride and attention to detail even in decline. Dan's mother Maggie was waiting on the porch. She looked older than her 68 years, more fragile. The past year had been hard on her, Tom's health failing, the ranch operations slowing, the weight of maintaining this place mostly alone. She came down the steps as Dan pulled up, and he saw the relief in her face. "Danny," she hugged him hard, held on longer than necessary. "I'm so glad you're here." Emma climbed out of the car, shy suddenly, confronted with a grandmother she barely knew in a place that might as well have been another planet. "And Emma, look how you've grown." Maggie bent down, smiled. "Do you remember me, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, but barely. That Christmas visit had been brief and tense. The women in Dan's life hadn't gotten much chance to know each other. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and coffee and the faint ghost of Tom's pipe tobacco. The furniture was worn but comfortable, everything in its place. The kind of order that came from living in the same space for 60 years. Photos covered every surface. Generations of Morrisons, cattle drives and roundups. The ranch at different seasons and decades. Your father's been difficult since yesterday, Maggie said quietly, leading Dan to the kitchen. The stress of losing his dad, I suppose. Dan looked at her. Dad? He's here? At the barn. He's been running things for years, you know, since Tom's arthritis got bad. James Morrison, Dan's father. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since a shouting match over the phone about Dan's career choices and his divorce and all the ways he'd disappointed the family. Jim had sided with Tom. Of course he had. They were ranchmen, both of them, and Dan was the grandson who'd chosen spreadsheets over saddles. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday at the Methodist Church. Tom had been a fixture in this community for 60 years. Half the county would show up to pay respects. Dan would have to stand in front of all those people, the prodigal grandson who'd abandoned the ranch and come crawling back, broken, divorced, and pretend he deserved to mourn. Friday passed in a blur of awkward small talk and whispered phone calls with the funeral home, and Emma exploring the ranch with a wonder that made Dan's chest ache. She found the horses, fed them carrots under the watchful eye of one of the ranch hands. She climbed into the hayloft in the barn. She ran through the pastures in a way she never ran in Chicago, like she'd discovered space existed. Jim appeared at dinner. He looked every one of his 68 years, hair completely gray, face lined deep from decades of squinting into the sun. He nodded at Dan but didn't offer a handshake. They ate in silence, broken only by Emma's questions about the ranch, questions Jim answered with more warmth than he'd shown his son in years. After Emma went to bed, Jim spoke directly to Dan for the first time. Lawyer wants to see us Monday morning. About the will. There's a will? Of course there's a will. Tom was specific about things. The way Jim said it made Dan's stomach tighten. Tom being specific about things was never good news. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. The Methodist church filled an hour before the service. Ranchers in their good suits, women in dark dresses, the whole community turning out. Dan stood at the door greeting people he barely remembered, accepting condolences that felt hollow. These people knew he'd left. They knew he'd turned his back on the ranch and the life it represented. Richard Thornton arrived 15 minutes before the service. Dan didn't know who he was at first, just another well-dressed mourner. But the way people's expressions changed when they saw him suggested this was someone important, someone powerful. Thornton approached Dan directly, hand extended, smile practiced. 55, expensive suit, the kind of presence that commanded attention. Daniel Morrison, Richard Thornton, Thornton Development Corporation. I've been trying to buy your grandfather's ranch for 5 years. He was difficult. The word hung in the air. The smile didn't reach Thornton's eyes. I understand you're having financial troubles in Chicago, Thornton continued, loud enough that people nearby could hear. Divorce can be expensive. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer, should you inherit, something that could solve a lot of problems. Heat flooded Dan's face. How did this man know about his divorce, about his financial situation? And why was he saying this here now at a funeral in front of the entire community? Emma was watching from across the room, her face confused and worried. She'd just heard a stranger announce to everyone that her father was broke. This isn't the time, Dan managed. Of course, my apologies. Thornton handed him a business card. But do think about it. Montana ranching is a dying business. No shame in getting out while you can. He walked away, leaving Dan standing there with the card in his hand and the eyes of half the county on him, judging, weighing, confirming everything they already believed about the Morrison boy who'd left and failed. The service was traditional, respectful. The pastor spoke about Tom's integrity, his dedication to the land, his quiet generosity to neighbors in need. Dan gave a brief eulogy, speaking words he barely remembered afterward about childhood summers and the lessons Tom had taught him about responsibility and hard work. But even as he spoke, he felt disconnected from his own voice, like he was reading someone else's script. The truth was, he'd spent most of his adult life trying to forget those lessons, trying to become someone different, someone better than the rancher Tom had hoped he'd be. And here he was, broke and divorced and 42, delivering a eulogy to a man who'd never thought he was good enough. After the service, people gathered at the ranch for the reception. The house filled with voices and casseroles and stories about Tom. Dan found himself standing in what had been Tom's study, looking at the walls covered with photographs. Decades of ranch life documented in black and white and faded color. Cattle drives and roundups, prize bulls and successful harvests. Your grandfather talked about you a lot, especially these last few months. Dan turned. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, small, thin, somewhere in her 70s. She had the kind of face that had seen everything and judged nothing. Clara Whitfield, she said, I've been your family's housekeeper for 40 years. I remember you from when I was a kid. She smiled. You were 7 last time I saw you. Wild as a March hare, always getting into something. That was a long time ago. Your grandfather was proud of what you'd accomplished in the city, Clara said quietly. Even if he didn't show it, he understood why you had to leave. Dan looked at her, trying to gauge if she was being kind or honest. With Tom dead less than a week, kindness seemed more likely. He left you more than land, Daniel, Clara continued. He left you a mystery to solve. Before Dan could ask what that meant, she was gone, disappeared into the crowd of mourners. Monday morning arrived too fast. The lawyer's office occupied a modest building on Main Street. William Crawford, attorney at law, the sign weathered and probably unchanged for 50 years. Crawford himself was thin, mid-60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Maggie, Jim, and Dan sat in leather chairs facing the desk. Emma was with Clara at the ranch, blessedly absent for whatever was coming. Crawford cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, looked uncomfortable in a way that made Dan's stomach tighten. Your father was very specific in his wishes, Crawford began. He spent considerable time making sure everything was exactly as he wanted it. He opened the folder in front of him and began to read. The first part covered charitable donations. The church, the county historical society, modest amounts. Arrangements for Maggie's financial security, a trust that would provide her income for life. All expected, all reasonable. Then Crawford reached the main provision, and his voice changed, became careful in a way that suggested he knew what was coming would detonate. To my grandson, Daniel James Morrison, I leave the entirety of Sweetwater Ranch. All 12,000 acres of land, the main residence, all outbuildings, equipment, livestock, and associated assets, along with all bank accounts and investment portfolios related to the ranch operations, with the following condition. Daniel must reside on the ranch for 6 consecutive months before selling, subdividing, or otherwise disposing of the property. Should he fail to meet this requirement, the ranch shall be transferred to the state of Montana for conservation purposes. The words seemed to echo in the small office. Dan felt the air leave his lungs. This had to be a mistake. Some kind of joke. Tom leaving him the ranch? Tom who'd spent decades disappointed in him? Tom who'd made it clear at every opportunity that Dan had betrayed the family legacy by leaving? Jim's face had gone completely white. His hands gripped the chair arms so hard his knuckles showed. Crawford continued reading, his voice even more careful now. To my son, James Morrison, I leave the sum of $25,000 and my personal effects, with my deepest regret that his decades of dedicated service to this ranch must end under these circumstances. I know he will understand that difficult decisions are sometimes necessary to preserve what matters most. The silence was absolute. Jim didn't move, didn't speak. He stared at the desk like he was seeing through it to something beyond. Maggie had started crying quietly, one hand over her mouth. Dan tried to speak. Couldn't. The ranch. All of it. 12,000 acres worth millions of dollars. Tom had given it to the grandson who'd abandoned it, not the son who'd devoted his entire adult life to maintaining it. Crawford set down the papers, removed his glasses, looked at Dan with something like sympathy. There's a sealed letter for you. Your grandfather requested you read it privately. He handed Dan a manila envelope, thick and heavy. Dan's name was written on the front in Tom's careful handwriting. The ranch currently has a bank account with $45,000, Crawford continued. Operating funds, enough to live on for the 6-month period if you're careful. After that, you're free to make whatever decisions you choose about the property. Jim stood abruptly, the movement sudden and violent. He walked to the window, stared out at Main Street. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing harsh. Jim, Maggie started. Don't. His voice was flat, dead. Just don't. Dan found his voice. There has to be some mistake. I can't run a ranch. I don't know the first thing about. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing, Crawford interrupted gently. I can assure you of that. He changed this will 6 times over the past 3 years. This version is what he wanted. The door to the office opened. Richard Thornton walked in like he owned the place. Marcus Webb behind him. Webb was younger, mid-40s, with the predatory look of a lawyer who specialized in intimidation. William, Thornton said, nodding at Crawford, I hope I'm not interrupting. Just observing. I have business interests here. Crawford's expression tightened. This is a private reading, Richard. Public record soon enough. Thornton's eyes fixed on Dan. Well, Daniel, congratulations. Quite the inheritance. The smile he offered was sharp, calculated. I'll give you $2 million cash right now to sign a purchase agreement contingent on your 6-month requirement. Think about your daughter. That money could change her life. Private school, college fund, security. Jim turned from the window, his face dark with rage and pain. Get out, he said quietly. Thornton raised his hands in mock surrender. Just making an offer. No offense intended. Montana winters are harsh. Ranching is dangerous for amateurs. Accidents happen, especially to city people who don't know what they're doing. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Webb smiled behind him, predatory and cold. I think you should leave, Crawford said firmly. This is neither the time nor the place. Thornton shrugged. My apologies. Daniel, you have my card. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. They left, the door closing behind them with a soft click that somehow felt like a gunshot. Jim walked out without another word. They heard his truck start in the parking lot, gravel spraying as he pulled away too fast. Maggie reached for Dan's hand. I don't understand. Why would Tom do this? Dan looked at the envelope in his hands, at Crawford's sympathetic face, at his mother's tear-streaked confusion. He didn't have an answer. Tom had left him everything and left his father virtually nothing. There had to be a reason. Tom didn't do anything without purpose. Read the letter, Crawford said quietly. Maybe it will help. They drove back to the ranch in silence. Maggie went to lie down, exhausted from emotion. Dan found himself in Tom's study, alone with the sealed envelope. The room still smelled like pipe tobacco and old leather. Tom's presence hung in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. Dan tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Tom's careful script. Danny, if you're reading this, you're probably angry and confused. Maybe thinking I've lost my mind in my old age. You're wrong about that. I've never been clearer about anything. You think I'm punishing you. I'm not. I'm saving you. This ranch holds a secret I never told anyone. A secret worth millions. Your great-great-grandfather Jacob Morrison discovered something in 1875. He hid it to protect the family from the kind of men who'd kill for what he found. The answers are in the house. Look where the light falls at dawn on the winter solstice. December 21st. Stand in this room and watch. Trust Clara. Trust no one else. Especially not Richard Thornton. Thornton knows about the secret. That's why he's been trying to buy this land for 5 years. That's why he won't stop until he gets it or destroys it trying. Don't sell to him, Danny. Not for $2 million, not for 10. Whatever he offers, it's not enough, because what's hidden here is priceless. Stay the 6 months. Find what's hidden. It's Emma's future. I'm sorry I was hard on you all those years. I'm sorry I didn't tell you I was proud of you for building your own life. But I'm not sorry for this. You're the only one I can trust with this burden. The land doesn't belong to us. We just take care of it for the next generation. Grandpa Dan read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. A secret. Something Jacob Morrison discovered in 1875, worth millions, hidden somewhere on 12,000 acres. It sounded insane, like the rambling of an old man losing his grip on reality. Except Tom hadn't been senile. He'd been sharp until the day he died. And Thornton's appearance at the lawyer's office, his immediate offer of $2 million, his veiled threats, none of that made sense unless there was something real to find. Winter solstice, December 21st, 3 months away. Dan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of land Tom had given him. The land he had no idea how to manage, no business owning, no right to inherit over the father who'd worked it for decades. The secret, worth millions. Emma's future. Trust Clara. Trust no one else. The door opened behind him. Emma stood there, face bright with excitement that died when she saw his expression. Daddy, Grandma said you inherited the ranch. Does that mean we're staying? He looked at his 10-year-old daughter, at the hope and fear warring in her eyes, and realized that for the first time in months, she wanted something. She wanted to stay in this place that was so foreign to her Chicago life, this ranch with its horses and space and possibility. I don't know, sweetheart, he said honestly. I don't know. Dan made the decision that night, sitting in Tom's study with the letter in his hands and the weight of 12,000 acres pressing down on him. Emma was asleep upstairs in a bedroom that smelled like cedar and old quilts. Maggie had gone to her own house in town. The ranch was silent except for the wind moving through the eaves and the occasional sound of cattle settling in distant pastures. 6 months. He could survive 6 months. Whatever Tom's letter meant, secret, treasure, mystery, it gave Dan something he desperately needed. A reason to stay that wasn't just about honoring a dead man's wishes. A possibility that this inheritance might actually be the salvation Tom claimed it was. The operating account had $45,000. Divided by 6 months, that was $7,500 per month. Tight but doable if they were careful. Emma's custody arrangement would have to be renegotiated, which meant calling Jennifer and explaining that their daughter would be spending the next 6 months on a Montana ranch instead of attending 4th grade in Evanston. That conversation was going to be spectacular. He called her at 9 when he knew she'd be home from work. You want to do what? Jennifer's voice went sharp with disbelief. Take Emma to Montana for 6 months? Are you insane? I inherited my grandfather's ranch. There's a condition in the will. I have to live here for 6 months before I can sell it. So don't live there. Walk away. You don't owe that old man anything. It's worth millions, Jen. If I can hold out for 6 months, Emma's college is paid for. Her future is secured. Silence on the other end. Jennifer understood money and security. She'd been the practical one in their marriage, the one who balanced checkbooks and planned budgets while Dan chased bigger returns and riskier investments. What about school? She can do online schooling or local school here. It's just 6 months. In the middle of nowhere, away from her friends, her therapist, everything stable in her life. She likes it here, Dan said quietly. I've never seen her this happy. That was true. Emma had spent the evening exploring the ranch with a freedom she never had in Chicago. No traffic, no strangers, no apartments with thin walls and arguing neighbors. Just space and sky and possibility. Jennifer sighed long and heavy. If you screw this up, if you drag her through another one of your disasters, I won't, I promise. Your promises don't mean much anymore, Dan. The words stung because they were true. He'd promised her a stable life, financial security, partnership. He'd failed on all counts. Let me try, he said. Please, give me 6 months to get this right. Another silence, then. Fine, but she comes back for Christmas. And if this goes south, if you can't handle it, she comes home immediately. Deal. After he hung up, Dan sat in the darkness and wondered what the hell he'd just committed to. He knew nothing about ranching. The last time he'd worked cattle was at 16. He couldn't fix a tractor or mend a fence or read a weather pattern. The ranch hands who worked for Jim wouldn't respect him. The community would watch him fail with the same satisfaction they'd felt watching him leave all those years ago. But Tom's letter sat on the desk, and the promise of something hidden, something worth millions, gave him courage he didn't actually possess. Morning brought reality in the form of Jim Morrison standing on the porch at dawn, hat in hand, face granite hard. We need to talk, Jim said, not quite meeting Dan's eyes. They sat on the porch steps while the sun came up over the eastern pastures. The temperature hovered just above freezing, frost on the grass, breath visible in the cold air. I've run this place for 20 years, Jim began, voice rough. Increased profits, modernized operations, built relationships with every buyer in 3 states. And your grandfather left it to you. Dad, I'm not finished. Jim held up a hand. I don't know what game Tom was playing, leaving you this place with some condition about staying 6 months. but I need to know your intentions. Are you planning to actually try to run this ranch, or are you just marking time until you can sell it to Thornton? Dan thought about the letter, the secret, the warning about Thornton, but Jim was already angry enough. Adding talk of hidden treasure would just make him think Tom had been senile. I'm staying the 6 months. After that, I don't know. I don't. Then you'll need help. This ranch won't run itself. I was hoping you'd stay on. Keep managing operations like you have been. I'll pay you. There's money in the operating account. Jim's laugh was bitter. Pay me to work the land I should have inherited. That's rich. I didn't ask for this. No, you just got lucky. Again. You screw up your life in the city, come crawling home broke and desperate, and Tom hands you millions of dollars worth of land. Jim stood, settled his hat. I'll stay through November. After that, you're on your own. I'm done building things for other people. He walked away before Dan could respond, climbing into his truck and driving off toward the northern pastures where the cattle needed checking. Emma emerged from the house in clothes Clara had found for her, jeans that actually fit, boots that weren't too big, a jacket warm enough for Montana mornings. Can I go see the horses? Her face was bright with hope and morning light. Stay where I can see you. Don't go past the barn. She ran off and Dan was left alone with the enormity of his decision and no idea where to start. The first week was a systematic education and failure. Dan tried to fix a fence in the south pasture and ended up tangled in barbed wire, hands bleeding, the fence worse than when he'd started. He attempted to move a small group of cattle and got thrown when his horse spooked at a rattlesnake. The fall bruised his ribs and his pride equally. A local rancher driving past stopped to watch Dan struggle with a broken gate latch, took a photo on his phone, drove away laughing. By Thursday, Dan was bruised, exhausted, and questioning every choice that had led him here. Emma watched him limp back to the house after another disaster, and her face crumpled with worry. Daddy, are you okay? Fine, sweetheart. Just learning. You don't know how to do this, do you? The honesty in her voice broke something in him. She was 10 years old and already learning that her father was incompetent at yet another thing. Friday morning, a battered pickup truck pulled into the yard. An older man climbed out, late 60s, weathered face, carpenter's hands. He wore work clothes that had seen decades of labor and a hat that had probably been new during the Reagan administration. You're Tom's grandson, he said, not quite making it a question. Dan Morrison. Jake Patterson. I was your grandfather's best friend for 40 years. He looked at Dan's bandaged hands, the careful way Dan held his bruised ribs. Heard you've been trying to learn ranching the hard way. News travels fast. In this county, you sneeze, everyone knows about it by lunch. Jake tilted his head toward the barn. Tom asked me to look after things if something happened to him. Didn't think that meant teaching his city boy grandson how not to kill himself. But here we are. I don't need charity. Good, because I'm not offering it. I'm offering help because Tom would want it and because watching you flail around is painful. Jake spit tobacco juice into the dirt. You don't know your ass from a fence post, do you? The bluntness was refreshing after a week of people talking around his incompetence. No, I don't. Then let's fix that. I've got time. You've got need. We'll figure it out. Over the next 3 weeks, Jake taught Dan the basics he should have learned 30 years ago. How to read cattle, spot sickness, judge condition, how to repair equipment, splice rope, replace fence posts without mangling his hands. The work was hard, physical, humbling. Dan's body ached in places he had forgotten existed. But slowly, incrementally, he started to understand the rhythms of ranch life. Emma settled into the local school, a small building that served kindergarten through 8th grade with a total enrollment of 93 students. She made friends with Lucy Martinez, Sheriff Cooper's niece, a quiet girl who'd lost her parents in a car accident 2 years prior. The two of them became inseparable, exploring the ranch after school, inventing elaborate games in the barn, sharing secrets the way 10-year-old girls do. October slipped into November. The days grew shorter, colder. Dan's hands developed calluses. His body adapted to the physical demands. He started to recognize the cattle as individuals, could spot trouble in a herd before it became crisis. Jake watched his progress with approval that felt better than any performance review Dan had earned in his corporate life. But the mystery of Tom's letter remained. Winter solstice was December 21st, 7 weeks away. Dan searched Tom's study whenever he had time, looking for clues, finding nothing. Clara watched him with knowing eyes but offered no guidance beyond cryptic comments about patience and timing. Late October, Emma discovered the trunk. She'd been exploring the attic on a rainy Sunday afternoon, Lucy with her, both girls bored and restless. The trunk sat in a corner under layers of dust and old blankets, a steamer trunk from the 1870s, brass fittings green with age. Emma called down the stairs, voice high with excitement. "Daddy, come look at this." Dan climbed the narrow attic stairs to find both girls kneeling beside the open trunk. Inside were artifacts from another century, a Civil War uniform, yellowed letters tied with ribbon, photographs that had faded to sepia ghosts. "Look at these," Emma breathed, holding up a stack of letters with careful hands. The letters were written in flowing script, addressed from Jacob Morrison to his wife Sarah. Dates ranged from 1875 to 1880. Dan carried them downstairs to better light and began reading. "Dearest Sarah, I have made a discovery on the North Ridge that will secure our family's future for generations. The vein is richer than anything I saw in California. But these are dangerous times. Claim jumpers murder men for far less than what I have found. I am telling no one except you. The map is hidden where only family will find it. Look to the house itself. The builder knows the secret. Trust no one. Love always." Jacob Moore letters followed, each referencing the discovery in oblique terms. Jacob had been a mining engineer before homesteading Montana. He'd arrived in 1875 during the height of the territorial gold rush. The letters suggested he'd found something significant, hidden it, and died before revealing its location to anyone except possibly Sarah. Dan spread the letters across Tom's desk, his heart racing. This was what Tom's letter had meant. Jacob's secret. Something hidden for 150 years. Clara appeared in the doorway, saw the letters, nodded slowly. "Tom showed me these years ago," she said quietly. "Your great-great-grandfather was nobody's fool. He knew what happens to men who advertise their wealth in lawless times. So he hid his discovery and waited for civilization to arrive. But he died before he could register the claim properly. Horse accident in 1882. He was 43. The secret died with him." Clara moved closer, picked up one of the photographs. Except he left clues. In the house, the letters, places only family would think to look. Tom spent decades searching. Did he ever find anything? Bits and pieces, enough to believe Jacob was telling the truth, enough to keep searching until the day he died. Her eyes met Dan's, enough to leave you this burden. That night, Dan researched Montana mining history. The 1870s had been peak gold rush territory, dozens of strikes within 100 miles of Sweetwater Ranch, fortunes made and lost, men killed over claims. The territory had been lawless, dangerous, exactly as Jacob's letters described. If Jacob had found a significant vein and hidden it, it could still be there, undiscovered. Worth, Dan did rough calculations based on historical gold production and current prices. Potentially tens of millions of dollars, but hidden where on 12,000 acres? The next day, Richard Thornton's pressure campaign began in earnest. Dan woke to find the south pasture gate open. 30 head of cattle wandered onto the county road. It took him, Jake, and Jim all morning to round them up. One cow got hit by a truck, killed instantly. The financial loss was significant, but worse was knowing someone had deliberately opened that gate. "It was latched," Jake insisted, examining the mechanism. "I checked it myself yesterday evening. Someone did this." 2 days later, the water pump serving the north pasture failed. Jake tore it apart and found sand in the mechanism. Clear sabotage. The replacement costs ate into the operating account, money Dan couldn't afford to lose. Thursday morning, Dan found his truck with all 4 tires slashed. A note under the windshield wiper. Block letters. "Sell now while you can." Sheriff Ben Cooper took the report, photographed the damage, wrote everything down with professional competence and visible futility. Without witnesses or evidence pointing to a specific perpetrator, he left the sentence unfinished. "It's Thornton," Dan said. "He's trying to drive me out." Cooper's expression went carefully neutral. "Richard Thornton is a powerful man in this county. Be careful what you accuse him of without proof. The message was clear. Dan was on his own. Friday afternoon, Thornton arrived at the ranch in a Mercedes SUV, Marcus Webb beside him. They walked up to where Dan was working on the barn door, Jake nearby with tools. Daniel, Thornton's smile was all teeth. I've heard about your troubles. Vandalism, sabotage, terrible business. What do you want? To help. This ranch is too much for you. You're putting your daughter at risk. Dan straightened, anger hot in his chest. My daughter is fine. Is she? Thornton gestured vaguely toward where Emma and Lucy were playing near the horses. Montana ranches are dangerous. Equipment accidents, animal injuries, weather. A single father alone out here, learning as he goes. What if something happens? Could you forgive yourself? The threat wrapped in concern was transparent. Jake moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. Get off my property, Dan said quietly. I'm trying to help you. You're trying to intimidate me. It won't work. Thornton's mask slipped just for a moment. His eyes went cold, calculating. You have no idea what you're protecting, do you? Your grandfather was a stubborn fool. It cost him his life in the end. The words hung in the air like poison. Tom had died of a heart attack, natural causes, except Thornton's phrasing suggested otherwise. What are you saying? I'm saying stubbornness is a Morrison family trait, usually a fatal one. Thornton pulled a business card from his pocket, held it out. $3 million, final offer. Think about Emma's future. Dan didn't take the card. Leave, now. Thornton dropped the card in the dirt, turned away. Webb followed, smiling like he'd enjoyed the confrontation. After they left, Jake picked up the card, tore it in half. That man's dangerous. You think he had something to do with Tom's death? I think Tom was healthy as a horse one day, dead the next. And I think Thornton's been trying to buy this land for years. Jake spit tobacco. Coincidence doesn't sit right with me. That night, Dan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Thornton's words, the implied threat, the way he'd looked at Emma. The vandalism had been escalating. What if it got worse? What if Thornton decided direct action was more effective than harassment? At dawn, Dan found himself in Tom's study, watching the first light come through the windows. Winter solstice was 4 weeks away. Tom's letter said to stand here at dawn on December 21st and watch where the light fell. But what was Dan supposed to see? The room was solid log construction, no obvious hiding places, nothing unusual about the way morning light moved across the floor and walls. Footsteps behind him. Clara stood in the doorway, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. Couldn't sleep? Too much on my mind. She handed him coffee, stood beside him watching the sunrise. Tom used to stand here every morning his last year, staring at the walls, the floor, the windows, looking for something he never quite found. The solstice clue, Jacob's message. The house itself is the map. That's what Jacob wrote. But a house changes over 150 years. Additions, renovations, repairs. Finding what Jacob originally built and what came later, Clara gestured at the walls. It's like archaeology. You have to strip away time. An idea sparked. Dan turned to look at the study with fresh eyes. This room was the oldest part of the house. Tom had told him that years ago. The original 1875 cabin had been right here, expanded over generations into the sprawling structure it was now. Jake knows carpentry. He could help identify the original construction. Clara smiled. Now you're thinking like family. Jake spent the next week examining the house structure, identifying what had been built when. The core cabin, the original 1875 structure Jacob had constructed, was now Tom's study in the room above it. The windows were original, though the glass had been replaced. The floor was original underneath layers of refinishing. The log walls were Jacob's work, chinked with mud and straw that had hardened to stone over the decades. This was the front of the cabin, Jake said, pointing to the east-facing wall. Door would have been here, right where this window is now. When they expanded in 1920, they moved the entrance and turned this into interior space. Emma and Lucy had been watching the investigation with intense interest. Now Emma pulled out the photograph they'd found in the trunk. Jacob standing in front of the original cabin. Look, she said, pointing at details in the faded image. He's standing at an angle, and he's holding surveying equipment. Jake squinted at the photo. That's a transit. For measuring angles and distances, mining engineers use them to map claims. So this isn't just a picture, Dan said slowly. It's data. Information encoded in a family photograph. Lucy, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. My uncle says criminals hide things in plain sight. Maybe Jacob was doing that? Hiding information where claim jumpers wouldn't think to look? The girl was sharp. Dan studied the photograph again, noting the precise angle of Jacob's stance, the way he held the equipment, the specific position relative to the cabin windows. We need to compare this to the actual structure. See if we can reconstruct what he was measuring. Over Thanksgiving weekend, a dinner shared with Jake, Clara, Maggie, Sheriff Cooper, and Lucy, they worked on the problem. Emma made careful measurements of the current room. Lucy drew diagrams. Jake identified original architectural features. Dan used his financial analysis skills for something more interesting than spreadsheets, converting physical measurements to data points, looking for patterns. The breakthrough came Monday evening. Emma noticed that in Jacob's photograph, sunlight was hitting the cabin at a specific angle, creating shadows that aligned with architectural features. She'd been studying the photograph for hours while Lucy did homework beside her. Daddy, look. The shadow of the roof hits right at the window frame, but our roof doesn't do that anymore. Dan examined the image. She was right. The roof had been raised when the second story was added in 1920, but on the winter solstice when the sun rose at its lowest angle, the light would hit differently, he said. Lower, more horizontal. Maybe that's what Tom meant. We have to see how the solstice sunrise hits the original windows. They had 3 weeks to wait. In the meantime, Emma and Lucy found something else. The two girls had been playing in the barn when they discovered a wooden box wedged between old beams near the hayloft. The box was old, hand-constructed, sealed with what looked like tar or pitch. Emma brought it to Dan in triumph. Inside was a leather-bound journal, remarkably preserved. Jacob's surveying notes from 1875. Pages of calculations, coordinates, sketches. But the coordinates didn't match real locations. Dan checked them against modern maps, and they pointed to empty air or impossibly distant places. It's encoded, Jake said, examining the journal. Smart man, your great-great-grandfather. He wrote down everything but made it useless to anyone who didn't know the key. The key has to be the house, Dan said. That's what all the letters suggested. The house is the map. These numbers must correspond to architectural features or measurements. They spent the next week decoding, using the room dimensions, window placements, beam locations as reference points. Dan's head ached from the mathematics, but slowly a pattern emerged. The encoded coordinates, when properly translated using the house as a key, pointed to a specific location on the northwestern section of the ranch. December 10th, Dan and Jake hiked to the coordinates. Steep terrain, heavy forest, rocky outcrops. They found it, an old mine shaft entrance, partially collapsed, covered with 150 years of growth and rockfall. This is it, Jake breathed. Jacob's discovery. The entrance was dangerous, unstable. They'd need proper equipment, timber for shoring, tools, safety gear. The work would take days, cost thousands Dan barely had in the operating account. But looking at that dark opening in the mountainside, knowing Jacob had stood here a century and a half ago and found something worth killing for, Dan made his decision. We'll do it. Buy what we need. I'll figure out the money. They ordered supplies and started excavation work the next Monday. Slow, careful, dangerous. The shaft went back 30 feet before they hit the rockfall that had sealed it. Every foot required timber supports, checking for stability, making sure they wouldn't bring the mountain down on their heads. Wednesday, December 15th, Marcus Webb arrived with a temporary restraining order. Cease all excavation pending environmental review. A judge in Helena had signed it. The court date was scheduled for January. This is bullshit, Dan said, scanning the legal document. Thornton paid off a judge. Maybe, Sheriff Cooper said, serving the papers with evident reluctance. But it's legal. You have to stop. Jake looked at Dan, question in his eyes. That night, Dan made a decision that crossed legal lines. They'd work at night, no lights, no noise. 3 nights until the solstice. 3 nights to clear enough of the shaft to see what Jacob had found. The work was brutal. December nights in Montana dropped below zero. They worked by moonlight in the occasional small lantern, cleared rock, installed supports, dug deeper into the mountain. Dan's hands froze despite gloves. His body screamed from the labor. But the shaft opened, foot by foot, revealing worked stone that proved this was Jacob's mine, not a natural formation. December 21st dawned clear and cold. Dan left Jake at the mine to continue work and drove back to the ranch. He stood in Tom's study at 5:47, Emma beside him, both watching the eastern windows. The sun rose at its lowest angle of the year. Light streamed through the original windows at a trajectory it hit only one day annually. The beam illuminated a specific floor plank and carved into the old wood, hidden under layers of refinishing but now visible in the precise angle of solstice light, were symbols. Emma gasped, "Daddy, look!" Dan knelt, traced the carvings. They matched notations from Jacob's surveying journal. This was it, the final piece. They pried up the marked plank. Beneath it, sealed in wax and hidden for 150 years, was a metal box. Inside, Jacob's final letter, a detailed map of the mine interior, and the original claim certificate filed in Helena. The letter was specific. 40,000 ounces of gold in recoverable veins, worth $2 million in 1875 dollars. Worth $80 million now. Dan's hands shook reading it. This was why Tom had left him the ranch. This was why Thornton wanted the land so desperately. He tried calling Jake at the mine. No answer. The satellite phone should have worked. Dan tried again. Nothing. Dread filled his chest. He grabbed his coat, told Emma to stay with Clara, and drove toward the mine faster than was safe on icy roads. The entrance had collapsed. Fresh tire tracks, recent rockfall, and Jake's truck sitting empty. Dan ran to the rubble, started digging with his bare hands, shouting Jake's name. No response. He called Cooper, shouted the emergency, kept digging. 2 hours that felt like days. Cooper arrived with a deputy. Other ranchers appeared, drawn by emergency radio calls. Everyone dug, desperate, knowing that time underground without air meant death. Finally, Jake's voice, weak but alive. "I'm okay. Trapped. Side tunnel. Keep digging." Another hour cleared enough space. Jake emerged bleeding, bruised but breathing. Dan grabbed him, relief and rage mixing in his chest. "2 men," Jake gasped. "Came around 7 this morning. Hit me from behind. When I woke up, the entrance was coming down." Sheriff Cooper took the story seriously this time. Attempted murder. The tire tracks matched a vehicle registered to Thornton Development Corporation. State police were called, but Thornton had an alibi. Business meeting in Helena, confirmed by a dozen witnesses. The company truck had been reported stolen the night before. His lawyer produced paperwork. Without direct evidence, Thornton ordered the attack. No charges would stick. Dan understood the message clearly. Thornton would kill to get this land, and he had the resources to make murder look like accident or coincidence. That night, Dan made copies of everything: Jacob's papers, the mine map, the claim certificate. He uploaded files to cloud storage, sent copies to the lawyer, the state mining office, a local newspaper. If something happened to him, the evidence would already be public. The war had begun, and Dan was fighting an enemy with money, power, and no conscience. But now he knew what he was protecting, and why Tom had trusted only him with this burden. The land held a fortune, and Thornton would do anything to claim it. The local newspaper ran the story 3 days before Christmas. Historic gold claim discovered on Sweetwater Ranch. Family battles developer for rights. The reporter was a young woman from Billings who'd driven out to interview Dan, photographed Jacob's letters and the claim certificate, written 6,000 words that turned the conflict into a David versus Goliath narrative, irresistible to regional media. By New Year's, television stations from Denver and Seattle had picked up the story. Cable news ran segments. The internet discovered Montana ranchers and hidden gold mines and corporate villains. Within a week, Dan's story went semi-viral. Not massive, but enough that Thornton Development Corporation suddenly faced public scrutiny they'd never dealt with before. Richard Thornton held a press conference. Expensive suit, controlled environment, reporters he'd carefully selected. He claimed the mineral rights had been purchased from Tom Morrison in 2019 for $500,000. Produced a signed document. announced his intention to file suit for ownership. Dan watched the press conference on Clara's television, rage building with every word. The document was a lie. Tom had never sold anything, but proving forgery required resources Dan didn't have. Lawyers, expert witnesses, court fees that could run into six figures. That evening, Dan created a crowdfunding campaign. The story wrote itself. Single father inherits ranch with hidden gold mine. Corrupt developer tries to steal family legacy. Emma's photo, the historical letters, Jacob's original claim certificate. He asked for $25,000 to cover legal costs. The campaign raised $67,000 in 2 weeks. Donations came in increments of $20, $50, $100. Working people from across Montana and beyond, sending what they could spare. Messages accompanied the money. Stand up to the bastards. Don't let them win. For Emma's future. A retired teacher in Missoula sent $500 with a note. My grandfather lost his ranch to men like Thornton. Make them pay. The money changed everything. Dan hired a law firm from Helena specializing in property rights and mining claims. 2 partners and an associate descended on Sweetwater Ranch in early January, examining documents, interviewing witnesses, building a case. The lead attorney was a woman in her 50s named Patricia Chen, who'd spent 30 years fighting corporate land grabs across Montana. Thornton's made enemies, she told Dan during their first meeting. We'll find them. People who will testify about his methods, his history. This isn't his first attempt to steal land through intimidation and fraud. Chen hired a forensic document examiner from the FBI's Art Crime Division, a specialist in historical papers and forgery detection. The expert spent 3 days examining Thornton's supposed purchase agreement, comparing it to verified samples of Tom Morrison's signature from bank records, legal documents, personal letters. The report was damning. Tom's signature was definitely forged. Wrong pressure patterns, incorrect letter formations, hesitation marks that suggested tracing. The paper stock was manufactured in 2021, 3 years after the document's claimed date of 2019. Digital analysis of the PDF file showed metadata indicating the document had been created on a computer purchased by Thornton Development Corporation just 4 months ago. This isn't just fraud, Chen said, showing Dan the report. This is stupid fraud, like they didn't expect anyone to check. Arrogance or desperation, I'm not sure which. Dan studied the analysis, feeling something hard and cold settle in his chest. Thornton had killed Jake, or tried to. Had Tom's death really been natural? The question haunted him. Clara provided the answer in late January, approaching Dan in Tom's study where he'd been reading legal briefs until his eyes blurred. There's something I need to tell you about your grandfather's death, she began, wringing her hands. I should have said something months ago, but I was frightened. Dan set down the papers, gave her his full attention. Tom died 2 days after Richard Thornton visited him. I was here. I heard them arguing in this room. Clara's voice shook. Thornton wanted to buy the ranch. Tom refused like he'd done a dozen times before. But this time was different. Thornton got angry, threatening. He said Tom would regret his stubbornness, that old men have accidents, that Montana winters are dangerous. And 2 days later, Tom had a heart attack. At 82, after passing his physical with perfect marks 2 weeks prior, he was healthier than men 20 years younger. Clara met Dan's eyes. I think Thornton poisoned him. I can't prove it, but I know what I heard, and I know the timing. Dan pulled up Tom's death certificate. Natural causes, heart failure. No autopsy had been performed. Standard procedure for elderly decedents with documented heart conditions. Except Tom hadn't had any heart conditions. His medical records showed a strong, healthy cardiovascular system. We need to request an exhumation, Dan said. Toxicology screening. If Thornton poisoned him, he'll have covered his tracks, used something that metabolizes quickly, leaves no trace after weeks. I've thought about this endlessly. Clara's face was anguished. I'm telling you so you understand what kind of man you're fighting. Not because we can prove murder. Chen agreed to include Clara's testimony in the civil case despite the lack of physical evidence. Pattern of behavior, history of threats, circumstantial support for fraud charges. It wouldn't convict Thornton of murder, but it would paint him as dangerous, ruthless, capable of anything. February brought escalation. Dan's brake lines were cut while the truck sat in the school parking lot. He discovered it when the brakes failed on a mountain road, Emma screaming in the passenger seat as Dan fought for control. They crashed into a snowbank at 20 miles per hour instead of going over the cliff at 60. Luck, not skill. Pure dumb luck. Emma had nightmares after that. Dan would wake to hear her crying in her bedroom, calling for him. She'd crawl into his bed like she hadn't since she was 6, trembling, needing the reassurance of his presence. During the day, she was brave, telling Lucy that bad men couldn't stop them. But at night, the fear showed through. "Daddy, what if they hurt you? What if you die like great-grandpa Tom?" He held her, feeling the weight of his choices. He'd brought her here, put her in danger, all for money and pride and a dead man's legacy. "I won't let anything happen to us, I promise." But promises didn't stop the harassment. Equipment failed mysteriously. Fences cut, cattle scattered, small acts of sabotage designed to drain resources and morale. Jake stayed at the ranch full-time now, sleeping in the bunkhouse with a shotgun beside the bed. Clara kept Emma and Lucy close, never letting them wander far from the house. The community rallied. Other ranchers started driving past Sweetwater more frequently, watching for suspicious vehicles. Sheriff Cooper increased patrols. The feed store owner called if anyone from Thornton's company showed up asking questions. A network of informal protection formed around Dan and Emma, because this story had stopped being about one family and become about something larger, about whether a rich man could use money and intimidation to steal what others had built. The preliminary hearing happened in late February. Thornton's lawyers filed motions to dismiss, claiming Dan's case was based on conspiracy theories and family legends. Chen countered with the forensic evidence, the documented harassment, Clara's testimony about threats. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over property disputes for 30 years, reviewed everything with careful attention. Then she set a trial date for mid-March and denied Thornton's motion to dismiss. "There appear to be significant questions of fact requiring resolution," she stated from the bench. "This case will proceed to trial." Walking out of the courthouse, Chen looked satisfied. "She's not bought. That's our first victory." Marcus Webb approached them in the parking lot. Alone, no Thornton in sight. He looked smaller without his employer's presence, diminished somehow. "I need to talk to you," he said to Dan, voice low. "Privately." Chen stepped forward, protective. "Anything you say to my client, you say in front of his attorney." "Fine, I'll testify against Thornton. Full immunity from prosecution, witness protection if necessary. I'll tell you everything." The words hung in the cold Montana air like frost crystals, sharp and transformative. Chen recovered first. "Why?" "Because I signed up to be a tough lawyer, not an accessory to attempted murder. He ordered me to sabotage the ranch, collapse the mine, do whatever it took to drive Morrison out. I thought it was just aggressive business tactics." Webb's hands shook slightly. "Then he told me to cut the brake lines, to hurt the kid if necessary. Make it look like an accident. I refused. He threatened my family." "Do you have proof? Recordings, documents?" "Everything. Emails, recorded phone calls, payment records for the men he hired to do the jobs I wouldn't. I've been documenting since December, preparing for this." Webb pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "Insurance. Thornton's going to kill me when he finds out, but I can't keep quiet about a child being targeted." Chen took the flash drive like it was made of platinum. "We'll need formal depositions, sworn testimony, cooperation through the entire trial. You'll have it. Just keep my family safe." The trial began March 15th in the county courthouse, a 100-year-old building with high ceilings and wooden pews that had hosted generations of disputes. The courtroom packed beyond capacity, local ranchers, media, curious townspeople drawn by the drama. Dan sat at the plaintiff's table with Chen and her team, feeling the weight of every eye on him. Across the aisle, Thornton radiated confidence and expensive cologne, flanked by 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than most ranch trucks. Emma watched from the gallery, sitting between Clara and Maggie. She'd insisted on being present, wanted to see her father fight back. Lucy held her hand, both girls solemn and alert. Chen laid out the case in her opening statement. The forged document, the pattern of harassment, the attempted murder of Jake Patterson. the threats against a 10-year-old child. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, building a narrative of corporate greed and criminal conspiracy that had the jury, 8 ranchers, 2 teachers, a retired nurse, and a hardware store owner leaning forward in their seats. Thornton's lead attorney responded with sneers and dismissal. This was a desperate man creating conspiracy theories to justify keeping land he couldn't manage. The purchase agreement was legitimate. Any harassment was coincidental or fabricated. Their client was a respected businessman being slandered by a failed financial advisor who saw this trial as his last chance at a payday. Day 1 featured the forensic document examiner. She walked the jury through her analysis with clinical precision: paper dating, ink composition, digital metadata, signature comparison. By the time she finished her testimony, the jurors were looking at Thornton's lawyers with open skepticism. Cross-examination tried to suggest the analysis was flawed, that document dating was imprecise science, that signatures vary naturally over time. But the expert was unshakable. The document was forged, created in 2023, not 2019. No question, no doubt, no alternative explanation. Day 2 belonged to Clara Whitfield. She took the stand wearing her Sunday dress, hands folded in her lap, voice steady despite visible nervousness. She described 40 years with the Morrison family, Tom's character, his dedication to the land. Then she described Thornton's visit 8 weeks before Tom's death. He said Mr. Morrison would regret his stubbornness, that old men have accidents, that Montana winters are dangerous for people who don't know when to accept help. And 2 days later, Chen prompted, Tom was dead. Heart attack, they said, but he'd just passed his physical. Doctor told him he had the heart of a 50-year-old. Thornton's lawyer objected: speculation, no medical expertise, circumstantial at best. The judge sustained some objections but allowed the testimony to stand as evidence of Thornton's character and intent. Cross-examination was brutal. They attacked Clara's memory, suggested she was biased toward the Morrison family, implied she might have financial motives for supporting Dan's claim. Clara endured it with dignity, never wavering, answering each question with the same steady certainty. I know what I heard. I know the timing. I can't prove murder, but I can tell the truth about threats. Day 3 brought Marcus Webb. The courtroom tension ratcheted up the moment he entered. Webb wore a simple suit, no expensive accessories, looking like a man who'd shed a skin and emerged raw underneath. He took the oath with a hand that trembled slightly. Chen led him through it methodically. His employment with Thornton Development, the escalating demands, the criminal acts he'd been ordered to perform. Webb held nothing back, detailed every conversation, every instruction, every line he'd crossed. Mr. Thornton ordered you to sabotage the Morrison Ranch? Yes, cut fences, disable equipment, make it too expensive and dangerous for Morrison to stay. And when Mr. Morrison wouldn't leave, Thornton told me to collapse the mine entrance while Jake Patterson was inside. Make it look like an amateur mining accident. Webb's voice cracked. I arranged it, hired 2 men, gave them the timeline. Patterson nearly died. Anything else? He ordered me to cut Daniel Morrison's brake lines. When I refused, he said maybe the little girl needed to learn about ranch dangers, maybe a riding accident. He was explicit. Scare them, hurt them, whatever it took to make them leave. The courtroom erupted. The judge gavelled for order. Emma's face had gone white. Clara held her tightly, whispering reassurance. Webb produced the recordings then. Audio of Thornton giving orders, discussing payment for illegal acts, planning the mine collapse. Digital files, professionally authenticated, impossible to dismiss as fabrication. The jury listened with expressions ranging from anger to disgust. Cross-examination tried to destroy Webb's credibility. Convicted felon, disgruntled employee, seeking immunity by betraying his employer. But Webb had too much evidence, too much detail. And his motivation, protecting his own family from a man who'd threatened them, resonated with the jury. Day 4 was Thornton's turn. He took the stand with confidence that felt rehearsed, fake, denied everything, called Webb a liar seeking revenge, claimed the purchase agreement was legitimate, that Tom Morrison had been secretly negotiating for years. insisted any harassment was either Morrison's imagination or the work of disgruntled former employees with no connection to Thornton Development. You expect us to believe this is all coincidence? Chen asked during cross-examination. The forged document, the sabotage, the threats, the attempted murder? I expect you to recognize a desperate man's fantasy when you see it. You told Clara Whitfield that old men have accidents. I never said that. She's mistaken or lying to protect the Morrison family. You ordered Marcus Webb to collapse a mine with a man inside. Webb is lying to save himself. I never ordered anything illegal. Then explain the recordings. Thornton's mask cracked. Just for a moment, his face showed something cold and furious. Those recordings are out of context, misinterpreted. My lawyers will prove your lawyers can't explain away your own voice planning a murder. The judge sustained an objection, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Thornton lose composure, seen the calculation behind the mask. Day 5 featured supporting witnesses. Ranchers who'd lost land to Thornton under suspicious circumstances. Former employees who testified about pressure tactics and threats. Financial experts who traced money from Thornton Development to the men who'd collapsed the mine. A web of corruption and violence documented with receipts and testimony. Closing arguments stretched across day 6. Chen spoke for 90 minutes, weaving every piece of evidence into a narrative of greed and criminality. She pointed at Emma in the gallery, described her nightmares, the terror of crashed brakes and explicit threats. She reminded the jury that Tom Morrison, pillar of their community, had died under suspicious circumstances after rejecting Thornton's offers. This isn't just about property rights or mining claims, Chen concluded. This is about whether rich men can use fear and violence to take what others have built, whether our community will tolerate corporate thugs threatening children, whether we stand up to bullies or let them win through intimidation. You have the power to answer those questions. Use it. Thornton's attorneys argued conspiracy theories and circumstantial evidence, claimed Webb was a liar, the recordings were out of context, the forged document was a misunderstanding. But their hearts weren't in it. The evidence was overwhelming, and they knew it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Dan spent that time walking the courthouse halls with Emma, both of them silent and anxious. Win or lose, this trial had exposed Thornton's methods. But winning meant security. Losing meant years of appeals, continued threats, Emma growing up in fear. The jury returned at 4:30. The foreperson was a rancher in his 60s, a man whose hands showed 50 years of hard work. In the matter of Morrison versus Thornton Development Corporation, we find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. The mineral rights belong to the Morrison family. The purchase agreement is fraudulent. We award punitive damages in the amount of $5 million for harassment, intimidation, and attempted murder. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Dan felt his knees weaken, had to grab the table for support. Emma was crying, Clara holding her, both of them laughing through tears. But Chen wasn't finished. Your Honor, given the testimony and evidence presented, I request that criminal charges be filed against Richard Thornton for fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy. The judge looked at the county prosecutor, who nodded. Sheriff Cooper stood at the back of the courtroom, already moving forward. Mr. Thornton, the judge said formally, you are remanded to custody pending criminal proceedings. Bail is denied due to flight risk and danger to the community. Cooper handcuffed Thornton in front of everyone, the media, the community, the people he tried to intimidate into submission. Thornton's face was murderous, but he said nothing as they led him away. Spring arrived slowly in Montana, snowmelt revealing a landscape transformed. Dan watched the changes from Tom's study, now his study, each morning with coffee and the satisfaction of knowing the war was over. Thornton faced 25 to life on multiple counts. His company collapsed under the weight of civil suits from other victims, emboldened by Dan's victory. Assets were seized, accounts frozen, an empire built on intimidation dismantled piece by piece. Mining engineers arrived in April to assess Jacob's discovery properly. They spent 3 weeks surveying the mine, testing samples, mapping veins. Their report was stunning. Conservative estimate, 50,000 ounces of recoverable gold over 20 years of careful extraction. Current market value exceeded $100 million. Dan established Morrison Mining LLC with Chen's help. hired a professional mining operation to handle extraction, ensured every safety regulation was exceeded, set up environmental monitoring that went beyond federal requirements. The first ore came out in Heartland, 1,000 ounces that sold for just over $2 million gross. The money changed everything and nothing. Dan paid off every debt, set up college funds for Emma and Lucy, established trusts that ensured 3 generations of Morrisons would never face the financial desperation he'd known. But he kept the ranch operations modest, refused to turn Sweetwater into something flashy or excessive. The house stayed the same. The barns got necessary repairs but no gold-plated upgrades. "The land doesn't belong to us," he told Emma, echoing Tom's words. "We just take care of it for the next generation." She understood in the way children do when they've watched their parents fight for something larger than money. She'd seen what greed looked like in Thornton's face. She'd learned that some things matter more than profit. Summer brought normalcy Dan had forgotten existed. Emma thrived, losing the anxiety that had shadowed her since the divorce. She rode horses daily with Lucy, explored every corner of 12,000 acres, developed the kind of confidence that comes from real freedom. Her school reports showed improvement in every subject. The therapist Jennifer had insisted on said Emma no longer needed sessions. She was happy, adjusted, secure. Jake stayed on as ranch foreman, well-paid, respected, recovered from his injuries but carrying scars he'd wear forever. Clara remained the heart of the household, cooking meals that filled the house with warmth and normalcy. Maggie moved back to the ranch, taking rooms on the second floor, finally at peace with her husband's memory now that justice had been served. Dan started dating Lisa Cooper, Sheriff Ben's younger sister. She taught English at the county high school, drove a beat-up Subaru, preferred hiking to fancy restaurants. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, both of them carrying divorce wounds. But she made him laugh, challenged him intellectually, understood ranch life without needing constant explanation. Emma approved, which mattered more than anything. By October, a year after Tom's death, the transformation was complete. Dan looked in the mirror and barely recognized the desperate, broke man who'd arrived in September. Physically, he'd changed. Shoulders broader from real work, hands permanently calloused, face weathered by sun and wind. But the deeper changes were invisible. He'd found purpose, community, a version of himself that fit better than any corporate persona he'd built in Chicago. The ranch employed 12 people full-time, their wages funded by mining revenue. Educational tours brought visitors interested in historical mining and sustainable extraction. The operation became a model for how to balance profit and preservation, featured in mining journals and environmental publications. Jake started teaching workshops on traditional ranching techniques. Clara wrote a cookbook featuring Montana recipes from 7 decades. That fall, 8 months after the trial when autumn colors painted the valley, Jim returned. No grand explanation, just a quiet request to help with winter preparations. Dan accepted without questions. Life was too short for grudges, and Jim's knowledge was too valuable to waste. December arrived again, winter solstice. Dan stood in the study at dawn, Emma beside him now nearly 11 and grown taller, both watching the light hit the same floor plank where Jacob's secret had hidden for a century and a half. "We did it," Emma whispered. "We saved great-great-grandpa Jacob's legacy." "You did it," Dan corrected. "You found the trunk, decoded the photographs, never gave up when everything was scary. You're the real hero of this story." She smiled, embarrassed and proud. "Will we always live here?" "Always. This is home." That afternoon, Dan drove to the cemetery. Tom's grave sat under a pine tree, headstone simple and dignified. Dan stood there with hands in pockets, breath visible in the cold air, and talked to a dead man who'd saved his life by forcing him home. "I understand now why you did it this way. I was lost, broke, divorced, failing at everything. The money meant nothing. The career was empty. I'd forgotten who I was trying to become, something I wasn't." A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in the winter sky. "You brought me home, made me remember where I came from, what matters, who I really am. The gold isn't the treasure, you knew that. The treasure is this." He gestured vaguely at the mountains, the valley, the land stretching to every horizon. "Connection, purpose, roots." He pulled out a photograph. Emma on horseback, smiling in a way she never had in Chicago. Happy, confident, free. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for trusting me with this. I won't let you down. That evening, Emma discovered one final letter. She'd been exploring Tom's desk for the thousandth time, found a hidden compartment neither of them had noticed before. The letter was sealed, addressed to Dan in Tom's handwriting, meant to be found after everything else. Dan opened it with shaking hands. Danny, if you're reading this, you made it through. You found the gold, fought off Thornton, saved the ranch. I'm proud of you, son. I never cared about the money. Jacob's discovery was just bait to get you home, make you stay long enough to remember who you really are. You needed to come back. Not for me, not for the ranch, but for yourself. The city was killing you slowly, making you chase things that don't matter, forgetting what does. You were becoming someone hollow, someone lost. I watched you leave at 18, watched you build a life I didn't understand. I was hard on you, disappointed, angry. I'm sorry for that. You had every right to find your own path. But when you called last Christmas, I heard the desperation in your voice. Divorce, bankruptcy, failures piling up. You were drowning, and I couldn't throw you a rope from Montana. So I built you a boat and prayed you'd find your way home. The gold was real. That part wasn't a lie. But the real treasure is the man you've become while finding it. Strong, capable, rooted in something larger than yourself. That's what I wanted for you. Take care of this place. Take care of Emma. Take care of yourself. The land holds us more than we hold it. Remember that. I love you. I'm proud of you. I always was, even when I was too stubborn to say it. Grandpa Tom. Dan read the letter 3 times, tears running down his face unchecked. Emma watched him with concern that shifted to understanding as he handed her the letter to read. When she finished, she climbed into his lap like she hadn't in years, held him while he cried for the grandfather who'd loved him enough to save him in the hardest way possible. 2 years after Tom's death, Sweetwater Ranch had become something remarkable. Not just a working cattle operation, but a living example of how to balance tradition and progress, profit and preservation. Mining revenue funded land conservation across 3 counties. The Morrison Foundation provided scholarships to rural students, supported historical preservation, invested in sustainable agriculture research. Emma at 12 was everything Dan had hoped she could be, confident without arrogance, kind without weakness, smart and capable, and deeply connected to the land that had become her home. She talked about studying geology or mining engineering, about continuing Jacob's legacy in modern ways. Lucy remained her best friend, both girls inseparable in planning futures that included this valley, these mountains, this community. Dan married Lisa in a simple ceremony on the ranch, Jake officiating with a license he'd gotten online specifically for the occasion. Emma was maid of honor, wearing boots under her dress because some traditions mattered more than fashion. The reception filled the barn with music and laughter and the kind of joy that comes from community celebration. Jim Morrison gave a toast, voice rough with emotion. To my son, who left home to find himself and came back to save us all. Tom would be proud. I know I am. The mining operation continued, careful and sustainable, extracting wealth while protecting the ecosystem Jacob had loved enough to hide. Environmental groups studied their methods. Government agencies cited them as best practices. Universities brought students to learn how to do it right. But the land remained the heart of everything. 12,000 acres of Montana grassland, carefully managed, protected from development, preserved for whatever came next. Dan had learned what Tom tried to teach him decades ago. You don't own land like this. You're just its temporary guardian, responsible for passing it to the next generation better than you found it. Spring arrived, 2 years and change after that phone call at 2 in the morning that had altered everything. Dan stood on the porch at dawn, his ritual, now learned from Tom, watching the light change and the world wake up. Emma appeared beside him, also making coffee her new normal, despite being too young for it. You're happy here, she observed. Statement, not question. Happiest I've ever been. Even though we were scared, even though Mr. Thornton tried to hurt us, especially because of that. We fought for this place, earned it with more than money, with courage and work and refusing to quit when everything was hard. He looked at his daughter, seeing strength in her face that hadn't existed 2 years ago. You know the difference between owning something and belonging to something? We don't own the ranch, it owns us. Close enough, she understood the essential truth. Some things are worth more than their market value. Some legacies can't be measured in dollars. Some fights matter, regardless of cost. Later that morning, Dan walked to the mine entrance, now properly secured, professionally operated, nothing like the dangerous shaft Jacob had carved with hand tools and determination. He stood where his great-great-grandfather had stood 150 years ago, looking at rock that held fortune and future intertwined. Jacob had hidden his discovery to protect it from men like Thornton, men who'd kill for wealth, who saw land as commodity rather than trust. Tom had hidden the secret's location to protect it from his own son's impulses toward quick profit. Both men understood that the hardest part of wealth isn't finding it, it's stewarding it wisely, preserving it beyond your own needs and lifetime. Dan was the third guardian now. Maybe Emma would be the fourth. Or maybe the mine would play out in 20 years and the family would return to simple ranching. The gold gone, but the land remaining, which was how it should be anyway. Resources deplete, land endures. He thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago, broke, desperate, sleeping on a pull-out couch in a Chicago apartment that smelled like failure. That man seemed impossibly distant now, like a stranger he'd known briefly and didn't miss. The city had offered money and status and empty achievement. Montana had offered purpose. Some people search their whole lives for treasure and never find it. Dan had found his by going home.